Bulgaria as a means of providing a non-attribution country that no one has any particular bias against. If you're from China, if you're from Russia, if you're from the United States, just pretend that a foreign country has done something to your homeland. As a consequence, what would you be willing to do, and what do you think would be appropriate for you to do against Bulgaria based on the physical scenarios? So it's the same activities, only against this fictitious country of Bulgaria. So the proportions are about the same. We have a number of people who are willing to write letters, engage in protests, travel to engage in protest, a small proportion engaging in some kind of physical conflict, and a very small number who are willing to travel in support of physical violence against that country. And then we use the same scenario for cyber attack. And the distribution is somewhat similar to the homeland issue. Many people are willing to post a comment publicly on Facebook or Twitter. Some are willing to engage in defacements. Server compromises are acceptable to a certain proportion. And the compromising military servers causing harm against power structures and otherwise, a small percentage. So if we take this for what it is, this is telling us that a very limited number of individuals, regardless of skill or capacity, are willing to engage in extreme acts of violence. But what we might consider as kind of common forms of protest, a more healthy proportion of people are willing to do this. When we took these items and ran some crosstabs, we didn't find a lot of difference between the geographic actors. So whether you were a U.S. citizen or a foreign national, there were no significant differences between the two. But on gender, we separated this by male and female, and it seems as though males are a little more likely to travel for protest and confront government officials, at least on the physical side of things. On web defacement and server compromises, again, this is a little bit more heavily skewed towards men. This fits to a certain degree with what we know about the general demographic composition of the hacker community. If we think about cyber attacks as perhaps an extension of hacker capabilities, this is a somewhat interesting relationship and one that we might expect to see. Moving from the general basic demographics, we've tried to figure out ways to predict who's going to engage in these kinds of attacks based on certain criteria. So I'm going to walk you through some regression analyses through the statistical models that we've created. But first I want to give you a sense of the measures that we used. We tried to create a variety of different independent variables based on emotional national identity. How much do you attach yourself to your national identity? Your belief in equality for groups, antagonism towards outgroups, to groups who are different from you. The level of nationalistic ethnocentrism, so something akin to national pride or willingness to engage in violence based on your nation. The willingness to engage in either physical or cyber attacks. So taking our cyber items, we want to see if there's any correlation with physical attacks, and vice versa. So we have country of origin, willingness to engage in software and media piracy. Given the prominence of the anonymous and lulzsec attacks, we wanted to see if there's any relationship at all between piracy and acts of civil disobedience or protest or otherwise. We had some other items for different types of computer crime, but they weren't very correlated. They didn't really show any kind of relationship. The level of technical skill that a person has. And finally, demographics based on age and gender. So here's the national identity scale. I'm proud to be a citizen of my home country. I'm emotionally attached to my home country and am emotionally affected by its actions. Although at times I may not agree with the government, my commitment to my home country remains strong. I feel a great pride in the land that is my home country. When I see my home country's flag flying, I feel great. And the fact that I am a citizen of my home country is an important part of my identity. So this was a Likert scaled item ranging from 1 to 4. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. The more someone agrees with these statements, the more they have a very high emotive national identity. And we adapted a lot of these items from political science and from military science research on willingness to support military action in general. Belief in group equality. Again, the more heavily skewed towards agree, the more you believe in group equality. Group equality should be our ideal. All groups should be given an equal chance in life. We should do what we can to equalize conditions for different groups. We'd have fewer problems if we treated people more equally. We should strive to make incomes as equal as possible. And finally, no group should dominate in society. Outgroup antagonism. Some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups. If certain groups stayed in their place, we'd have fewer problems. It's probably a good thing that certain groups are at the bottom and other groups are at the top. Inferior groups should stay in their place, and sometimes other groups must be kept in their place. So those who are more supportive of outgroup antagonism, so this is again scaled towards agree, the more higher their overall willingness to engage in perhaps attacks. Nationalistic ethnocentricity. Other countries should try to make their governments as much like my home country's government as is possible. Generally, the more influence my home country has on other nations, the better off they are. And then finally, foreign nations have done some very fine things, but my home country does things in the best way of all. Now, this is actually a measure adapted from some research in political science that included some measures related to performance in the Olympics or in multinational sporting events. We didn't include them here and instead wanted to try to just create as brief a scale as is possible. On the attack side, we have the maximum form of attack an individual is willing to perform against either their home country or Bulgaria. So how far would you go in the context of an attack? We've used this as a correlate to understand if this predicts any form of attack in general. For a country of origin, being a U.S. citizen or a foreign national, within this sample, our foreign nationals comprise about 10% of the overall sample. And this includes students from China, Russia, the Middle East, including Iran, and a few other nations. And then finally, participation in piracy. This was how many times in the last 12 months have you knowingly downloaded, used, or made copies of software or media? So media being television, music, or movies. And this might be of interest, the computer skill item. We included a battery of questions related to how they use technology, what kinds of things they can and can't do with computers, and used these 3 items to create kind of an advanced skill factor. Can you use an operating system like Unix or Linux? Can you use a standard computer programming or scripting language? And have you ever installed an operating system like Unix or Linux? That way we get those who might have a slightly higher skill set relative to others. And then age and gender. So, taking these items, we tried to develop a model to predict the most extreme act that an individual would engage in. So, what predicts the most severe attack against their homeland in a physical context? What was significant is cyber skill. So how much computer technology skill do you have? The more skilled the actor, the more willing they were to engage in an extreme form of physical protest. Homeland support, what nation are they from, was also related. Willingness to perform a cyber attack, this was a positive relationship. So if you were going to engage in a physical act, you're also likely to engage in a very serious type of cyber attack. Pirating software or media was also significant. So the more they engaged in piracy, the more likely they are to engage in a physical attack, which is kind of interesting. We weren't expecting to find this. And then outgroup antagonism. This was actually a negative relationship. So those with minimal outgroup aggression were more likely to engage in some kind of protest. So this is somewhat interesting. Perhaps there's maybe an activism effect at play, someone who feels there should be generally little aggression towards other groups, and who feels as though cyber and physical attacks are related. When we used this model to predict cyber attacks against the homeland, we found some of the same relationships. An emotive national identity was relatively significant, but it's negative. So those who have a minimal emotional attachment to their home country are willing to engage in cyber attack, which we didn't find in the physical model. U.S. citizens were more likely to engage in cyber attack. Willingness to perform a physical attack was highly related here, so there's a significant correlation between these two acts. And then the pirating software or media was again significant. So we're seeing piracy as a somewhat significant predictor. These homeland models worked really well. There's a problem, though. We couldn't get the Bulgarian attack models to work at all. Nothing was significant in terms of predicting the most severe type of attack. It could be that we're missing some important predictors, that the items that we have just are not correct. It might be, alternatively, that it's no specific predictor. So let me walk you through a few other models that we tried to develop to get at this issue. We created a dummy variable for multiple attacks. Would you only do one thing, or would you be willing to engage in multiple attacks? And with this, we actually found some of the same relationships. On the physical end of things, engaging in an attack against your homeland, those who believe in group equality were more likely to engage in multiple forms of physical attack against their homeland. For outgroup antagonism, this is again negative. So those with minimal aggression towards outgroups or towards groups that do not resemble them were more likely to engage in physical acts. The homeland variable is significant, so U.S. citizens were more likely to do this. And then finally, cyber attack was also significant. Now, given that the U.S. is coming up as a somewhat important predictor here, perhaps it has something to do with the perspective of free speech, with political expression here in this country. We're not quite sure if this is something distinctive or otherwise. On the cyber end of things, the homeland issue drops out, as does outgroup aggression, but negative emotional national identity is still significant. So those who have minimal attachments to their home country are more likely to engage in multiple forms of cyber attack. Piracy is again significant, as is a willingness to engage in physical attacks. What's interesting is that we were finally able to get the Bulgarian models to work, so this foreign attack finally hung together. On the physical end of things, outgroup antagonism is again negative. So the less extreme you feel about outgroups, the more likely you are to engage in multiple attacks. The cyber attack variable is significant too. On cyber attacks themselves against Bulgaria, only two things mattered: a willingness to engage in physical attacks and group equality. But here we're seeing a negative relationship. So those who feel that group equality is not important, that we should actually have some kind of apportioning of groups within any given community, is significant. And this is somewhat different than what we were expecting to find. Now, based on this, we've just looked at severity and we've looked at multiple types of attacks. So we wanted to see what happens with each specific form of behavior. And given that the distributions are a little funky, we had to only include certain items because otherwise we couldn't get the models to work. There just was not statistical power. So here, the signs are a reflection of positive or negative relationships. And we have the odds ratio below, as well as, it's probably hard to see, but these little dashes are significance for each variable. So you can see that doing something, individuals who are willing to do something on behalf of their nation, this is mostly negative. Cyber attacks don't appear to matter for some reason when it comes to doing any type of activity. But it is completely important for writing a letter, engaging in physical protest, traveling to engage in a protest, and confronting a government official. These are extremely significant variables. And the same with advanced skill. So the more skill an individual has, the more likely they are to engage in physical attacks. Outgroup antagonism is negative here across multiple forms, and group equality is only significant when it comes to writing a letter. The other variables are not included here because they were non-significant. In terms of cyber attacks against the homeland, we see physical attacks as, again, being highly significant predictors, and the same with piracy. Emotive national identity is also relatively low, so it seems as though individuals with minimal attachment to their home country are more likely to engage in cyber attacks. Group equality is only significant for doing something and posting a message on Facebook, and it's again negative in a slightly different direction than what we would have expected. On the physical end of things, with regard to cyber attack against Bulgaria, this was again a very highly related, very positive relationship. Age was significant for doing something. So the older you are, the more likely you are willing to do something against a foreign nation. Outgroup antagonism was significant for only writing a letter and participating in a protest. And then when it comes to cyber attacks, there were only 3 significant predictors out of all those independent variables. Piracy and engaging in a physical attack predicted web defacements and bank server compromises. And posting a message on Facebook relates to group equality as a